The book is called The Anti-Mary Exposed, Rescuing the Culture from Toxic Femininity. And boy, did I ever think about this book this past week when I was seeing some images coming out of protesters who are angry about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, covering themselves in blood and just looking at how they embrace such a deformation of the image and likeness of God and sort of an anti-feminism. It was just mind-boggling to me, and I really thought of this book, The Anti-Mary Exposed. We've invited Dr. Carrie Gress on to have this conversation. Good morning to you, Dr. Gress.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me this morning.
Yeah, praise be to God. Thank you for your time. Have you been paying attention to some of these images coming out of these protesters?
Yeah, I think you'd have to be living under a rock to not see them. I mean, it's been amazing how widespread it has been, even in the build-up, obviously, after the leak of Dobbs and continuing, and it's certainly not abating.
Yeah. I mean, it's really, really bizarre. And, your book really points out what really has happened to women over the past 50 years. They've had abortion now for so long, and they seemingly can't understand how they could live or move on unless they have the right to murder their unborn children. How do you explain this in any other terms other than demonic?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you could certainly explain it in terms of Marxism, because the underlying belief is that work will make you free. And that's what is the impediment. I mean, that's the lie that we've been told, is that women are naturally at odds, or, children are really an obstacle to our happiness. So that's sort of part of the psychological reasoning that goes behind it. But in terms of where they've gone with it and the violence of it, I think that's really, the big tell as far as the demonic and pagan elements that have really kind of taken over. And the sad thing is that, the reason aspect of abortion just hasn't existed for a long time. We have the science. When was the last time you saw a debate between a pro-lifer and a pro-abortion individual? They don't happen, because the pro-aborts know they don't have a leg to stand on. So what they've had to do is really resort to violence, and because naturally the act is violent, but also because that's the only thing they have. They don't have an appeal to reason anymore. So it comes back to sort of a Machiavellian response, which is exactly what we're seeing, and why Catholics are being so targeted, because we're the ones that actually have real reasons and a real stand against this in a way that most other churches haven't maintained over the last 50 years.
And I just don't understand why a protester covering themselves in blood thinks that's going to wake us up and go, you know what, you're right, we do got to give you abortion. It's so absolutely perverse. Like, there was even when the rumors of this was happening, there was that woman in New York, up in New York area, where she was dressed in a bikini and did a mock abortion, and it was gross and diabolical. I mean, I fear for these people, because I don't think they truly understand what it is they believe and what they do here. The implications are so eternal.
Yeah, no, they have no idea. I mean, I think that's the reality, is that the point I make in my book is that we've been so brainwashed so thoroughly by elite women in this culture, and there's really not a way to navigate through that unless you have faith, or unless you have had amazing women in your life who said, no, this is a bunch of lies, and, you need to look in a different direction. But for the most part, a lot of us just have never heard an alternative story, and so it just fits right in with everything that they've been told, everything that celebrities are encouraging them to do. And so that's really what's driving it, is they don't have an alternate way to really consider what womanhood is.
It's funny you mentioned celebrities. I watched a video yesterday of celebrities trying to convince us that eating bugs was the way of the future. I'm like, yeah, right. Okay.
Yes.
It's bizarre.
No,
we live in bizarre times, such bizarre times. Well, going back to your book, it seems to me that women have been sold a bill of goods. I mean, it makes me think of the question, are men just so amazing and awesome that that's why women want to be just like them?
Yeah, no, and that's kind of the weird thing is really, and I've written several pieces at the Epic Times about this, in terms of what women have been told, this desire to be like men, but at the same time we simultaneously hate them. So it's this weird sort of resentment that's been brewing. And this is the sad thing about what we're seeing also with the trans movement and all this confusion about what it means to be a woman. In fact, I'm working on a book right now on that very question. But yeah, it's incredibly sad to see what we've been sold and what we've allowed ourselves to fritter away in our lives because of this, holding this masculinity up on a pedestal.
And what about the attacks on Our Lady directly via the destruction of her statues at various churches around the country? Why do they hate Our Lady?
Yeah, I mean, this is really at the heart of it is what they hate is virginity, and they hate motherhood, and she's the Virgin Mother, so of course they're going to hate her. She is the icon of womanhood, and the very thing that they've been told over and over again is bad, and the thing that they've been told will make them unhappy and will enslave them. So it's those things that they're really embracing is this idea of false liberation. And so that's why Our Lady specifically is being attacked. But that's who's been attacked from the very beginning of this movement is, the quintessential woman.
It's like they just can't help themselves in so many ways. Like they're searching. You can tell, like we're all searching for something greater than ourselves, like meaning, right? Like every human being, I think, is doing that. But they refuse to look in the one place they'll find it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And the sad thing is that this is a movement that ultimately can only look at what the individual wants. And again, you see this with the trans movement. I want to become a male, even though I'm biologically a female. That desire is only rooted in sort of the will. And so this is the very same thing with them. They don't see God as a loving paternal gift to them that gave them life. They don't see any of those things. They just see what it is that I want, and that's really what's driving them is their own wills, and not a bigger picture of life.
Oh, did you see that story down in Australia about the reporter being handed a sign that said Mary should have aborted her child, meaning Jesus?
Yes. No, and that it just is so beyond the pale. And this is one of the things that I said in the Epic Times is I think that they're burning through their credibility with this extremism, because most women probably would have, who are pro-feminism would probably have been open to wearing the pink hats and doing the demonstrations and whatnot. But when you really get to this point where you're saying, we have to demonstrate by all these disgusting and even, they're felonies, these things that these women are doing or suggesting that women do. I think that's really crossing a line. And I think a lot of women are sort of scratching their heads saying, this isn't really what I signed up for in terms of trying to figure out what is really equality for women. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But they're not seeing a big bump politically in the polls for abortion at this point and for the messaging behind it. So I think this is really why, because this is just not appealing. It's not attractive, and it's not compelling.
No, it certainly isn't. But I tell you, there is something I absolutely do agree with when it comes to the anti-life death cult that is protesting today. I do think that they should abstain from sexual relations. I believe this is a brilliant idea, and I wholeheartedly support it. No, you look at all of the crazy in our world today, which is getting worse. People are seemingly attacking the image of God by doing crazy things to themselves. The piercings, facial tattoos, the colors, just everything. It just seems like it's an attack on the image of God, which is implanted and stamped into our very beings. And when it comes to women in particular, God gifted women with beauty. And that beauty has a design and an intent. And we see that specifically in Our Lady. And I would like you to touch on that and talk about that from an anti-feminist perspective. Not that you have one.
Yeah, I think no, exactly. That's why I'm on. No, I think it's a fascinating question because, of course, in my research in my book, The Marian Option, one of the things that I discovered was that every apparitionist said to one that Our Lady was the most beautiful woman they had ever seen. And so her beauty isn't accidental. In fact, St. Therese said after she saw Our Lady, had an apparition of her as a young girl, that you would want to die just to see her again because she was so beautiful. Wow. So there's a reason for that. And part of it is to reveal God's beauty, but also women have a very unique calling to raise everybody up, to bring people higher, to show them the love of God in a very unique, special, and merciful way. So that's an important aspect of it, I think, that we've forgotten. And, of course, women have this longing for beauty. If you look at all the amount of money that's spent on cosmetics and clothing, and all of this isn't just vanity, but it's an kind of an inborn desire to actually be beautiful for the very reasons that Our Lady is beautiful. Obviously, it's been highly distorted, and people can reject it and abuse it and whatnot. And we see plenty of that going on in the world. But it's there for a reason, and I think that that's one of the things that we as women need to really rediscover is, why do I have this drive to be beautiful, and what's behind it, and how do I respond to that in a way that's more like Our Lady, instead of something that we have to hate or reject. How do we twist that desire?
Carrie, Gress, we know so many people piggyback off of what you just said there. A lot of women in the culture today have recognized that feminism has not been the great saving grace that they thought it was going to be.
Right.
But
Right.
the problem that they're finding is that they are basically fabricating a femininity because it was never shown to them. They were never taught how to be authentically feminine. They were taught how to be a feminist instead. And so they're trying to fabricate these, what you might say, traditions and these womanly things, and it comes off as fabricated. So what would your advice be to a lady who recognizes this and realizes, like, oh my goodness, I've been caught up in this, and now I don't know how to move forward?
Yeah. No, and that's something I think about all the time. And one of the reasons why Noelle Mering and I have written the books, Theology of Home 1 and 2. 3 is actually coming out next week. But Theology of Home 2 addresses that specifically, where we talk a lot about what it does it mean to be a woman, and how do we start, filling up our imagination again with what that means, because a lot of us didn't have the role models that, where you learn that. And women are very, very, we're very affected by the people around us and by fashions. And we think that's a good thing when it comes to clothing, but we think it's a bad thing when it comes to ideas. But it happens across the board, and we don't really realize what we're absorbing through osmosis. And so the real key is to find, figure out what those traits look like, figure out what it looks like in a woman who is gracious and loving and humble, instead of someone who's angry and bitter. How do we kind of model our lives in a different way? And so that's one of the things, actually, that in Theology of Home 2, the spiritual art of homemaking, Noelle and I went into pretty deeply in terms of how do we start thinking about what it means to be a woman in a way that's not creepy or weird or odd, because I think a lot of times, like you said, it comes off as being either very saccharine or fake, or there's something that doesn't feel like it's been integrated properly into the women that are doing it. Now, there's certainly an element of fake it until you make it that I think is important too, because the alternatives are even worse. So, I think we have some real challenges, and Noelle and I are actually working on a project right now just to help women, who feel like they need to recover from feminism, because there aren't resources out there to help us start thinking about what womanhood is without this context of really idolizing the masculine.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that. I always enjoy seeing your publications. They're so beautifully designed, and there's a lot of care that goes into that. I suggest, dear listener, to check out Dr. Gress's work for sure. Theology of the Home 1, 2, and 3 coming up next week. Dr. Gress, I have a question, regarding something you mentioned before the break. You were talking about, people don't really have the communication skills that maybe they had, 50, 100 years ago. There seems to be that there's not a lot of dialogue in regard to, feminists and people who are more traditional. In your experience, have you ever had any discussions with people that were productive? And what sort of advice would you give our listener for conversations that touch on this very hot button issue?
You mean that we're productive in terms of helping change people's minds?
Yes, or at the very least, to have a decent conversation about it.
Yeah, I think the first thing is just to really be aware of what's going on in the way that we've been brainwashed. I think, one of the things that I always come back to is just looking at how unhappy women are, and those statistics are really very easy to find. Just the movement has not been good for women as a whole. We've, everything from divorce, suicide, drug abuse, substance abuse, all of those things have really gone through the roof, and sort of asking the question, well, if feminism is actually working for us, why are we seeing these things increase instead of decrease? The typical answer is, well, we haven't, and feminism hasn't taken over sufficiently yet, but
Right.
I don't think that argument holds anymore. I think you also look at a lot of women, and more and more women are speaking up. I'm hearing from them regularly. But women who have lived the feminist agenda, and then they get to their 50s, 60s, 70s, and they're like, what have I done? My parents have died. I don't have children. I don't have a husband. I had an amazing career. I've got a full bank account. But what else? All the things that I thought were important are not important at this point in my life. And
Wow.
how do I recalibrate my life to have meaning and fulfillment at this stage? So these are some very sad, tragic elements, because you can't, the biological clock is done. You can't, turn that back at that point. So I think just looking at the lies that are there is probably a really important thing to point out when you're having those conversations about, how much we're pitted against men, how much we're pitted against our children, and really what is it for? What is the goal? Largely to just work and have a bank account. Well, those things are not ultimately fulfilling. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that we can tackle this, but certainly an important one is really just to live it out and to start understanding those gifts that women have in spades that are very downplayed or really even undercut. Things like graciousness and compassion and tenderness, kindness, all of those things really speak volumes, certainly much more than any argument will.
I think the devil's gotten a 2-for-1 special out of the feminist movement here. The anti-feminist movement, I would say, is probably a better term. Because as women have felt the need to compete directly with men and become more like men, men have become emasculated and don't truly understand what true masculinity is, and nor do they understand how to interact with women properly. And, I was thinking about an article that I read 16, 17 years ago about a feminist who burned her bra back in the 70s and was advocating for the free love movement. Many decades later, discovered that women were putting themselves into compromising situations in hopes of attracting the attention of men, because men weren't giving them attraction, all right? They weren't giving them attention. And so they would do things that they think that these guys would want, and therefore compromise their moral code, put themselves in emotional, psychological damage, and the rest. And the men, so it was like a 2-for-1 special. The men were addicted to porn. They didn't want real relationships. I mean, it's a total collapse of family. It's a total collapse of society we're talking about.
Yeah, no, and that was the goal from the beginning, was really to destroy the family. It's kind of a 3-for-1, because, of course, then if you have a pregnancy happens and the baby is killed. So everybody's kind of destroyed by it. And that's the tragedy is I think there's a lot of men who just really don't know what to do because the rules keep changing. And so it's a lot easier to just sort of cave up instead of, trying to engage with a lot of these women who are just, ugly and vile and vicious. So, yeah, I think that was one of the things that I was really conscious of in my book, was trying not to blame men for everything. I thought, they've been blamed for everything for 50 years. I think we can have one book that doesn't really pin everything on them, but actually looks at women's culpability and what it is that we have done to ourselves, women doing to other women in terms of the messaging and whatnot. So, yeah, I think it's a huge problem. I've just finished reading the book, The Decline of Males by Lionel Tiger. He's a man that came up with the term male bonding. So he knows a little something about men, but it's really fascinating to just look at what has happened to men because of this and how it's just changed the whole structure, because a lot of them aren't getting the job. They're now competing with the women that they potentially could have married for jobs, but they can't get the jobs because the women are getting the jobs. And so they never get to that point financially where they feel like they can ask someone to marry them. And anyway, it's just this remarkable cycle of things that have really broken down the family in so many different ways that, thank God we've got God and Our Lady to help us, and the church to help us figure these things out, because I think otherwise, it's certainly a situation that we could despair of, because it's so complicated. And the messaging is just so powerful, and the lies are so deep in the hearts of so many at this stage.
I guess there's no wonder why then the war over the next generation is so fervent and so hot right now. I mean, we're seeing people push back all across this country on perversities in the education system and entertainment and more. I mean, Disney stocks are plummeting, and I think the average person, the average family are like, we don't want this. Okay, we don't want this stuff anymore. But golly gee whiz, crazy times we live in. Prayer, fasting, and penance is always the answer. Praise be to God. And Dr. Carrie Gress, The Anti-Mary Exposed, great book. I encourage everyone to check it out. Thank you for your time today. God bless you. God love you. Have a great day. You can find her book at theologyofhome.com. Theologyofhome.com. That's going to do it for hour number 1. Can you join us in the second hour? We'd love to have you. Hang out with us if you can. We're going to have Dave Palmer on. We're going to have our game show, prizes, and more. You can hang out at grnonline.com/CDT.